Hello YouTubers! Today's fix is related to my 3 horsepower Sears Craftsman edger. This edger is 30 plus years old with a 4-stroke engine and 9-inch blade. It has served me well over the years. Recently, it's been getting more difficult to crank, usually firing up within the first 3 pulls. Now, nothing. And then there's this disturbing development. Gasoline pouring out the air filter. Stick around and let's figure out what's going on. My suspicions are that the diaphragm in the carburetor is either torn or just worn out, letting gasoline pour through and flooding the engine. Since it had been running and gradually was more difficult to start, logic dictates that I dispense with the typical spark and compression checks and proceed straight to possible carburetor issues. Removal of the carb begins by loosening these 3 bolts. As the fuel tank is lifted, a heat shield is discovered and set aside, along with 2 spacers and a washer under the 3rd bolt that I found off camera. The quick clamp on the fuel line is compressed and the tank removed. I'm not being too careful here because I plan on replacing the fuel line. The air filter is disengaged by turning counterclockwise and any residual fuel dumped out. There are 2 carburetor bolts that feed in from the back side of the mount and forward through the carburetor ears. I'm going to remove both nuts on either side of these bolts. These nuts have locking washers attached. Now the carburetor is gingerly pulled forward, paying particular attention to the throttle linkage, the Z-bend of which is shown here, which feeds through this governor arm. The gasket is in good shape, as is the throttle butterfly. The other end of the throttle linkage feeds up and under this plate opening. I'm going to use solvent and clean this carb before doing any work on it. I purchased this rebuild kit from my local farm and garden dealer. It contains a new diaphragm, gasket, needle valve, and valve seats, as well as Welch plugs. To order, they need the number off your engine. Let's grab some low-hanging fruit and start by removing this ratty-looking fuel line. It's important to note that this carburetor doesn't have a float bowl like many Briggs & Stratton carbs. In fact, when I presented it to the dealer, they told me it was manufactured by Tecumseh. The air filter mount can be removed with a Phillips screwdriver or, as I discovered, the opened end of a multi-bit ratchet driver. Pay attention to orientation as it is removed. Take note of these strange-looking mounting bolts. The thick rubber gasket built into the mount is in good shape and will be reused. I can't say the same for this throttle side butterfly. I will remove, examine, and clean up this piece probably with light sanding. Access to the diaphragm is gained by removing these 4 Torx screws. Carefully pry the cover loose and pay attention to the orientation of the diaphragm and gasket. These Welch plugs will not be replaced or removed as they are not showing signs of wear, nor are they rusty. Welch plugs typically cover chambers which may be sprayed with cleaner if you suspect contaminants in the carburetor. Note the small molded metal piece in the center of the diaphragm which presses against the needle on the needle valve relative to the need for more fuel. I finally located a socket that would fit this needle valve and turning it counterclockwise removed it. This is the valve, and the underlying spring. Spraying down through the valve opening causes the carb cleaner to come out the hole on the side where the fuel line attaches, and vice versa. At this point, some light sanding removes any old remnants of the old gasket and prepares the surface for the new one. Be sure to respray cleaner to remove old sanding dust, this in a well-ventilated area. Next, we tackle another needle valve removal. Line up the screw with a nearby point. In my case, I line it up with the corner here, then turn the screw inward gently until it stops, remembering the number of turns. Then reverse it and unscrew the needle valve until it can be removed. This valve has a brass washer shown here at the tip, and a valve seat that can be removed with a small hook or screwdriver. Replace the rubber valve seat with a new one from the kit. Press down gently around the seat perimeter with a small, flat screwdriver. The brass washer is replaced, and the needle valve screwed back into position. Tighten gently until the valve cannot be turned anymore, then back it off the number of turns you remembered from the earlier step. Next door, I attempt to tighten this needle valve as I align my screwdriver with a nearby corner as a reference point, but it seems not to want to turn any tighter, so I assume it's fully tight. Nothing to do here but remove it. Repeat the previous process and remove the brass washer and valve seat and replace it with the one from the kit. Then replace the needle valve assembly. Feel free to shoot some cleaner up into these holes while the needle valves are removed. Remove the diaphragm needle valve parts from the kit and assemble as shown. There was no rubber valve seat to replace here. Go gently on the tightening and be careful of the needle. The diaphragm gets fitted against the outside cover first, then the perimeter gasket is pressed on next. Turn the cover upside down and reassemble. I'm not using any thread lock on these screws since none was shown on the threads during removal. I'm snugging these up, not too worried about torquing them down, just nice and tight without much muscle. The thick gasket is replaced into the air filter mount. Remember I told you I was going to remove and clean that butterfly valve? This is the way it looks now. All it took was removing that one screw. The air filter mount is oriented such that the slot is turned toward the upper left of the choke arm and reattached with the strange looking bolts. I purchased a foot of new fuel line and cut to length. The quick clamps are applied and the line fed up onto the carburetor. Compress and slide one of the clamps up close to the connection and release. Begin the reinstallation by hooking one end of the throttle linkage onto the carb plate, then the Z-bend into the governor arm before mounting the carb onto its bolts. Hold the bolts in place so they don't slide backwards, then press on the carburetor and begin to thread the two nuts. Alternate the tightening of the nuts from side to side until snug. Test the throw of the throttle. The other end of the fuel line is attached to the bottom of the gas tank, and the quick clamp compressed into place and released. Both spacers and the washer are positioned as well as the heat shield. Pick up the tank and thread the bolts down through the top of the mount, into the heat shield, and through the spacers and into the top of the engine. Tighten all three bolts accordingly. The male pin on the air filter is aligned with the female receptacle on the housing, then the filter twisted into place. Gas has been placed in the tank but is not yet in the fuel lines. It may take a few pulls to start since there's no primer bulb. It runs and cuts like a dream. I hope this video helps you with your carburetor rebuild, as this project is complete.